a great deal of funding that comes to government is in a block grant form. And so there are a lot of rules about the disbursement of funds, and so that a particular set of resources may only be applicable to program delivery, and that can't then be used for training and capacity building, that it's not also able to be used then for case management or care coordination. And so there are, I think, all of the resources in play in this city, in this room, to get it done. And part of the key about collaboration is understanding what is the strength and value add that each constituent brings to the table. And so maybe it is that, again, in Chicago, where we have sort of non-designated funding, that maybe we spend less money on funding programs because the city is able to put so much into that, and we use our resources to help around training and capacity building for the organizations that the city is funding. But better understanding what are the limitations of people's funding, what are the dictates of their mission, so that we can better utilize each organization's resources to a greater good across the board. So just want to flag that. And I think that to the point that someone made earlier about care coordination, one of the other really phenomenal things that helps to facilitate that is that HIPAA has already taken care coordination into consideration, and it is this great space that allows for data sharing across the board toward that end. So it sets us up for, I think, great possibilities moving forward. So you guys did a great job with the quiz. I think that that's why you are the ones who are self-selectors by being registered to be at this conference, and we'll talk more about the difference between what we do with self-selectors and non-self-selectors throughout the day. But I want to frame for you that 5 years ago, my 5-year anniversary is September 6th. 5 years ago, we started this work focused on funding and evaluating programs, a positive premise that presumed more was in play than was actually possible at the time. 2 years in, and we were able to compile our experiences into 5 key learnings we learned, which structured our subsequent efforts. But while the results are very promising, clearly we cannot do it all alone. It's going to take change makers like Amy Campanelli, like Jim Reynolds. It's going to take visionaries like Diane Garrity, who's also in the room. It's going to take masterminds like Betsy Clark. It's going to take innovators like Lisa Morrison Butler. And it's going to take loud troublemakers like Rufus Williams. All of these different kinds of people need to be in play for us to move the ball forward, and so we're happy to have you in this room. So I share our learnings, many of which come from our experiences working with the people in this room, because we see the implications they have for the full system of youth services, but especially violence. The following is a snapshot of our history that informs the goals going forward. And we started with this poem from this young woman, Kyla, to remind ourselves that the youth are at the future and that they're also at the forefront of the work that we want to do. You know, years ago when I worked in the governor's office, I took one Thanksgiving, I went to spend it with young people at IYC Chicago. And I took 2 of my friends with me, Felicia Davis and Juliana Stratton. And one of the things that we did that day was play charades with the young kids. And one of the clues that day, the young man who was up was trying to draw it, and he just kept drawing a squiggly line. And no one could guess what was the charade, what was this thing that he had in his message. And so Julie went and sort of peeked at his card to see what it was, to see if she could help him out, and it was pyramid. And so we had a young man who was 16 years old in DJJ, and he did not know what a pyramid was. And so when you think about what does it take to get into DJJ, what are all the sort of layers and levers along the system before you end up there, how much of that is driven by the practical reality that his education system has failed him, that maybe he has some developmental issues or an IEP status, but there's always a lot more going on for a young person in these conditions that we often can not discern just from the surface. So with that in mind, digging down a little bit more deeply into it, just as a background, Get in Chicago has been in play for, like I said, just about 5 years. Between 2014 and 2017, we funded over 60 community-based organizations, reaching more than 14,000 youth throughout largely 7 communities, and you can see those up there. The key learnings are really at the core of what we've been doing, and they're not rocket science, but it really is about sort of taking the time to think through what's necessary. And so one of it is that I'll tell you it's about being place-based, about being situated in communities where young people are. In the beginning, we discovered that a huge number of community-based organizations were providing services for high-risk youth in schools. And the issue with schools is that it's clearly a value add for people because you know you'll find youth at schools. But the kind of young people that are highest risk are less likely to be in school. There's very few minutes to actually engage them in a school setting. And then what happens when violence spikes in the summer and school is out? And so, that's a key factor to take in mind, is that how can we shift our energies and put them at the core of where people are doing work? Another piece was about organizational capacity, and we've talked a great deal about that. It's the situation, I think, in our community is in the same way that I think Ben talked about deferred maintenance, we have to talk about deferred capacity. Community-based organizations get funded overwhelmingly for programs. And so if you get dollars strictly for programs, where is your opportunity to train your staff? Where is your opportunity to think about data? Where is your opportunity to bring in other kinds of systems and innovate? And so we have to think about what we need to do to sort of further support those scenarios. Measurement and data is clearly in there. How do you know who's come and what's happened for them? The improved implementation of programs, I always liken it to when your doctor tells you to take your antibiotics for 10 days, and if you only take it for 1 day, are you actually going to get better? And we found frequently there would be programs that were meant to last for 3 months that might only last for 3 weeks. And so I've been in court where a young man has been in front of the judge, and the judge looks and says, you've had mentoring, you've had sparks, you've had this, you've had that, and you're still back here, and so my sense of leniency towards you has evaporated. When in fact, did Jamal actually have all of those things? Did he only visit once and then someone checked him off as an attendee to their program? And so it's not just that the egregious scenario where Jamal doesn't get what Jamal needs, but that he's also been tagged with these things, and the set of responses to him subsequently are trailing him. And so when we talk about making sure that we get the right youth, that we engage them, and that we engage them to the extent with the fidelity that's required, it has implications on multiple levels that only sort of create and reinscribe bad scenarios for the young people that we're most interested in. And with that in mind, the last piece is really about zeroing in on this group that we call acutely high risk. And toward that end, and we'll talk about this more, it's not to suggest that other young people that live in communities of concentrated poverty don't demand, deserve, and need services. It's just understanding what are the right services for the right kids. We did a process evaluation with Chapin Hall to sort of dig deeper into this capacity issue that was funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and we learned a great deal about what makes organizations across the board more successful. We know that in an environment where we didn't have a state budget for several years, that people are in a position where their resources have to be stretched in different ways, and so that if we can't figure out how to ensure that every aspect of an organization is secure, then we can't actually expect organizations to be able to do the work they need to for this group of young people that demand our full, undivided attention without the ability to burn out, as Rick said, right? So with that in mind, we did some deep dives, and just doing a CANS assessment, that's an intake assessment for over 600 young people, you find certain kinds of scenarios, and a lot of these young people came from probation. So we're clear about their being at the highest risk level. But you can see from this sample group that 78% were suspended from school, over 70% had trauma exposure, most of them had contact with the police, they had physical disagreements, they have substance use. And so this goes back to this question of how do we think about the underlying issues. We know that there isn't ever going to be one program that's going to solve it for a young person, and that each young person is unique. And so this is, again, sort of pushing toward this need to understand them and what their individual issues are so that they can be addressed. And I think that it also will do a great deal when we think about public systems to do more in terms of forecasting, that maybe we've under-anticipated how many under 18 young people are in need of housing when we think about our budgets going forward and what kinds of allocations to make toward that. On the flip side, on the positive strength-based piece, I'll say that we were very pleased to see that 82% reported discussing personal issues with an adult inside their home, and 71% reported discussing issues with adults outside their home. And so in the latter, we can see the strength of the mentoring programs that we've funded to date. And in the former, we can just reiterate the value then of those parent engagement programs that many of us fund here in this room as well. Why is my slide not moving? There it is. And so this is something we put together early on, and this is something that we want to build on for the long term. When we first started doing this work, so many different kinds of people said, we are working with high-risk youth. And sometimes they were working with kids that were really in this lowest level economically disadvantaged. And the point that I want to make is that simply living in North Lawndale does not make you at risk for violence. That you may be economically disadvantaged. It may mean that you don't have the right kind of mentorship to understand how to fill out your FAFSA, or what schools to apply to, or what other kinds of services you might access. But that's an altogether different scenario than someone 2 levels up in the category that we're calling acutely high risk, that may have 4 or more arrests, that has dropped out from school. And so thinking about those characteristics, 13 to 18-year-old, repeated arrests, chronically absent or unenrolled, group 4 or higher disciplinary code infractions, documented IEP status, history of trauma, abuse, neglect, etc. The point more so here, and something that we want to build out, is what are the appropriate level of services for each of these risk levels, and which organizations have it as their strong suit to do each one of those, so that we just have a clearer sense of how do we navigate and assign people accordingly. That in mind, we've seen some amazing outcomes relative to capacity building. In 2015, all of the organizations that we were funding, we did a survey of all of the kids and discovered that just 18% of the kids really fit the acutely high risk group. And we were asking everyone to do acutely high risk. The bulk of them were in the 2 tiers below, but really overwhelmingly in the just disadvantaged group. With a lot more education about what does this group look like, what are their experiences, where are they to be found, how do you engage them. We did the exact same survey 2 years later in 2017. 59% of the young people were actually reflecting that. So I can't underestimate or devalue the value of the kind of capacity building supports that community-based organizations need, that they're in these spaces, that they're committed to them, that they live there, and have we given everyone the tools they need to be as successful as they can be. One example that I want to give you that's from just recent time is that last year, February of 2017, this young man, Antoine Jones, and many of you probably read about it in the newspaper, he was attempting to shoot 3 rivals across the street, and he missed, and he ended up killing a young girl, an 11-year-old girl, Tatiana, who was sitting in a car with her family. And what becomes so interesting about Antoine is that he is really the model of the work that we're talking about. By the time Antoine inadvertently killed her at 19, he had already been arrested 10 times. And so Antoine's trajectory is the trajectory of this pyramid and the work that we're trying to do. That the first arrest was at 15 and a half, and it was nonviolent. It was for theft. And so his second arrest came shortly after that. He managed to squeeze in 10 arrests in just a 4-year period, and 3 of them were after he turned 18, so an adult. What's also interesting is that somewhere around the second arrest, he started having a lot of technical violations. So what we see here is sort of in a span going up Antoine's life is that there's a moment there after that second, and so that's why I won't say, we keep saying 4 arrests, but it's individualized, and that's why this intake assessment and individualized treatment is so important. That it was the combination of just 2 arrests and many technical violations that should have flagged Antoine as someone that we recruit into one of our high-intense programs like SYNC. And that our goal then is that at 16, in theory, we would have Antoine and be working with him in a way so that Antoine doesn't become the person he was at 19 that ended up killing an 11-year-old girl. And so this is really about prevention, but how do we prevent if we don't have the data to understand what we're zeroing in on and who those young people are? The other piece is that we really have to understand that there's a big gap. You know, as my grandmother would say, that there's many a slip between a cup and a lip. And so the gap between what we want to do and what it takes to get it done, I think you can see some of that on this page, and these are things that we can't gloss over and that we really want to drill down on. And everyone sort of has heard over time just how important it is to have cognitive behavioral therapy. But just like I started by saying people don't want to acknowledge it, it's also a whole altogether different thing is that, you know, what is the cultural competence of our licensed clinical social workers in this space? Is it the kind of scenario where someone actually wants to sit down and spend time with them? What does it take to be able to, because we have personally, and this is some of the things that we've been struggling with, funded CBT, which seemed like a no-brainer. We know that funding for mental health services is down, so if we set off a group of our dollars to address this issue, but then no one shows up. We have dedicated therapists sitting down with money, ready to serve hundreds of young people, and they're not even getting 10% of that number in. And so how do we bridge that gap is something else that we need to sort of roll up our sleeves about. Some of it is about transportation. A lot of it is about cultural competency. A lot of it is about how we frame it. I will say that one of the things that I've seen out of an organization called Choose to Change that I think is a really productive approach is that they start off by giving all of the young people mentors. And then after maybe 2 months of being with the mentor then sort of takes them over to therapy, and that maybe that warm handoff is what sort of helps improve the likelihood that they engage. But that's just a possibility. But you can see that one of the challenges is about attending sessions, that we've got challenges a lot about fear and safety. Does someone want to go, you know, how many people feel comfortable, you know, when it's 99 degrees outside, rolling into a particular community and knocking on somebody's door and going and sitting in their house? And what kind of training does it take to make someone who's, you know, signed up for this kind of work feel better equipped to do it? And so this is all sort of under this framework of capacity building, and I think that we have to sort of demystify what we mean by some of these terms, because they're really just sort of the practical realities of what we need to do to get our work done. Toward that end, we have been pushing and are bullish at Get in Chicago moving forward, and I think that it's going to be implicit in all the conversation today about care coordination. And our feeling is that care coordination is going to make everyone's jobs better. It's that if we think about intake on a citywide level, that if all 2,000 young people roll through intake, and that we understand that of the range of things we already know that they need, mentoring, education, substance abuse treatment, housing, workforce, parent engagement, child care, legal support, therapy, what are the 3 most pressing for Sarah versus the 3 most pressing for John? And that how do we then connect them to those things to ensure that they get them? And then a mentor's job is to mentor. A mentor then can't say, well, when the mentor year or 2 years is over, where is John now? Because that mentor is on to their new batch of people. And so one of the core things about care coordination is to have a separate individual, a care coordinator whose responsibility is, it's like mom on steroids or something, right? Is to ensure that all of the things are happening that need to happen, and thinking about layering that in as a value add to the work that's already going on. So to help you guys understand why we drilled down to this number, which we're saying is a number within reach, is really about the data shows that there were 2,673 young people that arrested 2 or more times throughout the city. Then in some work that we did with probation and Avik Das, we drilled down onto a group of young people that had either shot someone or been shot while they were on probation and showed really high risk levels, and that number was 1,630. And so we think that somewhere between 1,600 and 2,600 is really the number of young people we're talking about. We also think that, knowing from research that Andrew Papachristos and others has done, that there's also a kind of ripple effect, so that to the extent that there's a really, you know, high risk troublemaker boy like Rufus, if he has siblings, then working with Rufus will invariably have a positive effect on his siblings. So even if we say 2,000, we expect the reach of those activities to be, you know, far greater than that. And so when we say doubling down on this number, that's why. And I think that it's an opportunity about this goal within reach. So that is the sort of overview of Get in Chicago in general. To ensure our collective impact in the next chapter, we're going to need an acutely high-risk specific landscape to help understand what's going to be needed to go forward. We'd like to see a lot more capacity building in this space to help workers do what they need to do. We need citywide intake and care coordination so that we can ensure that we can coordinate across these systems and that we can meet the individualized needs that are assessed at intake. But also in conjunction with not just the intake person, the youth, and their families. So progress has been made at the systems level to generate a great deal of excitement such that despite the grim realities that we read about in the papers every day, more than now and ever, we believe that we really do have a significant opportunity to reduce violence in a credible way in a short term, and that it is a goal within reach with our coordinated efforts. So, thank you.
You know, I have one, and obviously having been, I'm Jim Reynolds, one of the co-chairs of Get in Chicago, and I know when we started this effort 5 or 6 years ago, the organization raised about $45 million, all private dollars, no government funds, to attack this violence issue. We were created actually to bring down violence in certain communities. Can you get your pyramid back up there, that page that has that pyramid? There's a question embedded in here, if you go back to that pyramid. When we started 6 years ago, this whole issue of violence and at-risk youth, I don't necessarily know if there was a term called acutely at-risk youth at the time. I think they identified all these youth in Lawndale, Inglewood, South Shore, Roseland, as at risk, that last bottom part of the pyramid. And virtually all organizations that we were aware of, many of them that we were aware of, were focused on kids in that bottom part of the pyramid as they look to attack violence and bring the violence rate down. And as you saw from one of your other charts, we impacted 14,000 kids in this 6-year period. As we, first couple years, we were funding programs in the schools. And some of you may realize it was an incredibly unpopular decision for us to leave the schools, but the data indicated that we needed to leave the schools if we were gonna attack this issue of acutely at-risk youth. Early on, when the newspapers wrote a lot about us, they wrote a lot about us not reaching a large number of youth. But if you look at the pyramid, you actually see that the youth we were trying to reach is actually a relatively small number of youth that habitually commit crimes. If you stop and just think about whether you're from Lawndale or Inglewood, which is my old neighborhood, or South Shore or Washington Park or whatever, there's actually a small number of kids in even the worst neighborhoods that will pull out a gun and shoot somebody. There's a very, very, very small percentage of kids that would do that in even the toughest neighborhoods in the city. So that when you get up to the actual number of youth that are driving the violence and where we should be focused, it's that top of the pyramid, which most organizations in the bottom of the pyramid think they're in the top of the pyramid. And it's a small number of youth that we're talking about that's habitually creating these crimes. My question for you, Toni, is one, over the last couple of years, we've actually started to see organizations sort of understand the distinction with that pyramid. I know that we've talked to organizations about it, but from once we started to where we are now, the education around which youth, acutely at-risk youth, if you want to impact the violence rate, the organizations should be focused on, has obviously been delineated to a very large degree. What impact should Get in Chicago have now that we've sort of defined this, created this pyramid, as we move forward with this organization, as we're getting right down to the end of our life and our money?
That's my boss. He's asking me. Okay. I'm going to answer it. So, you know what I'd say is that there are so many people doing this work, doing it for a really long time, doing it super well. And one quick story that I want to say is that a few months ago, we lost one of those people, Terrence Isaac. I didn't expect to get upset. Terrence was an amazing worker on the West Side. And when he passed away unrelated to violence, the church was standing room only. The balconies, the back, people are crowded. They were young, they were old, they were all sorts of walks of life of people. And it was so powerful for me to see the impact that one man had on so many people's lives, right? So I say that to say that we have so many trained, efficient forces in this room doing the work that they've done for a long time and that are equipped to do that work well. What I see as the value add for Get in Chicago is it's a kind of just framework to help people operate better, right? And so one of the things I see my friends here from Parent Engagement, Youth Guidance, and they were doing parent engagement in a particular way for a while, but we pulled all of the evidence about, one, what has parent engagement been proven to do, and then two, what are the core components that allow it to do that? And as a result, they went through a training program with a cohort of some other organizations, and they were that much more fired up, that much more effective at recruiting people, that much more effective of getting it done. And they still do what they do. I'm not out there doing it with them, but the training helped to boost them up. And I would also say that it put them in a learning community with other similar people so that when they are struggling, how did you address this issue? How do you set yourself up here? What's the best place in a community to set up? How do you transport people? That they have other people in their larger community of service providers that they can turn to and talk to and sort of have best practices go. So to be quicker about answering Jim's question, what I see as our value add is really on three levels. One is about this capacity building. How can we help organizations with the tools and insights that they need to be able to do their job more effectively? Two, how do we understand who these young people are and what their needs are? And so if we think about introducing this citywide intake system, how much time do people spend trying to find the right kids? I see people hanging around hospitals trying to recruit the kids that they need for their programs. They're doing all sorts of things and they're not sure. Just in the last year or so, we've been working very closely with Avik Das at Probation, which has been phenomenal, and they already do intake. So they can tell you a great deal about the kids and they can tell you what their profiles are so that we know whether or not this kid is great for the kind of program you have to offer, or if maybe they're too much for that. Or if this kid is really low key and would be too low key for your really intensive CBT and should be shifted to something else. So the second thing is really about this intake and care coordination. And the third thing is about helping to understand who these young people are. So capacity building, intake, care coordination, understanding who the young people are. And I think that none of that we would do would work if everyone else weren't in play. Because one of the examples I gave, I think we talked about this at Advocate, is that if a young people, and Advocate's doing some phenomenal work, they got a great grant from CEJA to really think about how they can do more in the community for people who have been injured on the front line. And so if a young person gets shot or stabbed and are taken to Advocate and they get some help, and then they've got a care coordinator and that person's trying to connect them to other services. Well, you know, Lord forbid, what if 9 months later that young person gets injured again, but this time they present at U Chicago? Well, the people at U Chicago want to be helpful, but they have no idea what, you know, Matthew has been doing before. And that's part of the dilemma that we see across the board in terms of how can we do a better job at reassigning the existing resources. I have seen Matthews getting 12 services, and then I've seen Jamal getting 0 services. So if we know at a bare minimum all 2,000 young people need 3 services, we need some kind of air traffic control so that we can ensure that Matthew gets his 3, and Jamal gets his 3, but Rufus doesn't take them all. So I like to pick on Rufus. I know they say I'm done, but did that answer your question? And I just feel like I just want to take one more question because since we have a, not Rufus, yes, you.
Sorry, Rufus. I'm Mary Stoner Saunders on Strides for Peace. And I think that we work with multiple organizations to reduce gun violence, primarily smaller ones in the community. And I think, part of what you spoke about today in this pyramid, which shows where the greatest return on investment can be had on the top of that pyramid. But the panel before, I think, touched on a lot of things about the funding mechanisms. It's no secret we have incredibly fragmented, unstable, cost-ineffective funding mechanisms for organizations who are supposed to contend with the most entrenched, difficult, complex problems to solve. When I worked in gang intervention and youth development, I think we had 60 different funders, different timelines, different eligibility, different outcomes, different strategies, different frameworks. And then as the panel was talking about, we're not paying staff, we're not paying for talent development, infrastructure, and all those capacities. And then on top of it, dealing with the most fragile human beings on the planet, the most vulnerable people on the planet, those people on that pyramid, things change and shift. So one year we get $100,000 from Cook County to work with those top pyramid kids. And the next year they say, great work, we'll give you twice that much money, but do it in a different neighborhood. We don't just lose, advancement with those kids. They're fragile, we send them back. So this is a long-winded way to say that, I heard a lot of the panel and some of the stuff you're talking about with coordination and what we pay for is I would love to know, and I think it's something the philanthropic community could do, is what are the characteristics of funding that drive impact? We talk about evidence-based practice, which is awesome, but we don't often pay for it in a way that is sustainable. If we take a model of how we do startups and innovation, we don't fragment the financing of that in a way that impedes growth. And then the final thing that I just wanted to say that I think is embedded with what are the characteristics of funding that drive impact is also what are the unintended consequences of outcomes. And I think part of the reason it took us a while to get to the top of the pyramid was a lot of the outcomes we're asking people to report on every 6 months. We don't ask the prisons to report on their outcomes. We don't ask a lot of other organizations to report on 6 months outcomes in trying to address some of these problems. So I think that would be a really wonderful project that the city could engage in is what are the characteristics of funding that drive outcomes and not just evidence-based practice, but how we support the evidence-based practice. Thank you.
I think those are phenomenal points. I'm going to be very quick about just saying 3 things in response to it. One is that I think that at the core of even your shift is why this landscape scan is so important. Someone may have asked you to go to a different community because they didn't know who was already doing the work in that community. And so in part, setting that structure up will already know in advance who's supposed to cover what geographically. I would say that 2, it's no question that funding streams are constantly shifting and it makes it super difficult. And so in part, when we think about care coordination and agreeing in advance what does it take to serve quote unquote 2,000 young people, then we line up based upon that intake. 30% need child care, 60% need substance abuse treatment, and then you can forecast better in advance 2 and 3 years out what it is that you need. And so I think that that covers it as well. And then the last thing that I would say to you about your performance measures is that you should not be reporting on quote-unquote outcomes in 6 months, and I hope that it hasn't actually been framed to you that way. What we are actually attempting to do is that when you think about an individualized treatment plan, there's a goal for a young person. That goal might be to re-engage in school or get a diploma. That might be to complete a 16-week certificate program. Whatever those goals are that have been identified for a young person that you're working with, on a quarterly basis, we want to see notes that talk about what's the progress toward that goal, right? And so it is not that there is an outcome, so-and-so is better, right? It's that the goal was to get this GED, and this person has already accomplished 8 of the 16 credits that they needed to make that goal. It's a progress statement along the way. And it's those kinds of shorter term measures that lead to the longer term outcomes that ultimately people need to understand. And that's part of some of the thought leadership and education that we want to make across the board. I will tell you that 6 weeks in, when we started doing this work, people were asking me what were our outcomes. And I was like, oh my goodness. So anyway, that's all I have to say about that.